Hey everyone, I hope that you're well. Today I'm going to be doing my September wrap-up, and this will not be in two parts this time because I read 7 books this month instead of the 13 that I've read in August. I don't think I'm ever going to get to that level of reading quantity again, but nonetheless I'm pretty happy with 7 books. I was really busy this month, so the fact that I got any reading done at all is good for me. The first book I want to talk about is The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. So this book is the much anticipated sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, and it's set 15 years after the events in that book. We follow the perspectives of 3 girls/women. One is Aunt Lydia, who was an interesting character in the first book, but gets way more development in this one. We've got a girl who was raised in the regime of Gilead, and then a girl who lives in Canada, which kind of represents the free world. I'm going to keep this section of the wrap-up short because I think that there are a lot of other really good reviews on YouTube of the Testaments. That's a reason why I didn't actually put one out, because I just felt that I wouldn't really be contributing anything new to the discussion. But my biggest disappointment with the Testaments was that Margaret Atwood promised that she would kind of open up the world of Gilead and let the reader in on all sorts of secrets and things that we were not privy to from Offred's perspective in The Handmaid's Tale. For me, as a reader, the thing that I wanted to really see was the origins of Gilead. And Margaret Atwood does touch on that in The Handmaid's Tale, with Offred's recollections of the past. We see that the banks cancelled all the women's credit cards and then took the women away, things like that. But for me personally, that was just not a satisfying attempt at world building. It really left me wanting so much more information. So when The Testaments was announced, I was pretty intrigued, and I thought, we're finally going to get some answers. And we do see some of that in The Testaments. We see how Aunt Lydia came to be Aunt Lydia, which I don't really think was that believable, to be honest. And if you've read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about. There's this sudden transformation, and suddenly Aunt Lydia's like, well, I'm going to be Aunt Lydia now. When that didn't really seem to align with her character and her profession before Gilead came to be. But more so than that, we still didn't really get any insight into how there was a coup, right? How this happened. Was there any resistance to it on an institutional level, at a governmental level? Where was the military in all of this? These are all questions that I still feel didn't get answered in the Testaments. And for me, when I was reading The Handmaid's Tale, I thought, well, maybe this is an artistic omission, kind of being vague and ambiguous, especially because we're from an isolated and, I guess, myopic perspective here. But when we have Aunt Lydia, who would be privy to all of that information, we still don't get enough of that to the point where I would go, okay, I can see how that happened, or I'm convinced. So that was one of the weakest points of the book for me. I was also not really interested in the 2 younger narrators, particularly one in Canada, whose emotional reactions to things didn't really make sense to me. And I also felt that it wasn't really that literary. Now, that's not necessarily a criticism, but it leaves me a bit baffled as to why it was longlisted for the Booker Prize, and shortlisted too. So overall, I was a bit disappointed with this one. I also felt that the writing just wasn't of the same quality as The Handmaid's Tale, particularly in the way that Atwood created atmosphere. It was really not present in the Testaments, and it's one of the reasons why I still think that The Handmaid's Tale is quite a good book, despite the fact that it's a bit slow. I think that the writing really elevates the book for me. That was not present in the Testaments. That being said, it was a page-turner, it was entertaining, so I got that much from the book, which is why I didn't outright hate it, but it was probably the most disappointing thing I read this month. The next book I want to talk about is Night Boat to Tangier by Kevin Barry. I read this really early on in the month. It was longlisted for the Booker Prize. It did not get shortlisted. I didn't know how to feel about this one. I didn't really connect with it emotionally, and I think that's a common complaint among other reviews that I've seen. It's about two Irish gangsters who are waiting at the port of Algeciras, which is at the southern point of Spain. And one of the gangsters, named Maurice, has a daughter called Dilly, and Dilly is missing. He wants to reconnect with her, he wants to find her. So while they're waiting at this port, they are reminiscing about the past, they are talking to other people who are passing through the terminal. I think this book hinges upon the reader's emotional connection to these men and sympathy for their hardships. At the same time, I don't think Kevin Barry really does enough to make you fully empathize with these men. There's one scene in particular, closer to the end, that explains a particular deformity that one of the gangsters has. And it's clear that Kevin Barry really wants an emotional response from the reader, but it didn't resonate with me at all because I just didn't feel connected to these characters at all. So overall, I walked away feeling a little bit empty after reading it. It's a pretty depressing book. There's a lot of heavy themes in here. And I think it's worthy to explore those themes. And it does so rather well, but I ultimately just walked away feeling a bit dissatisfied with my reading experience. So I gave this one 3 stars. The next book I want to talk about is Non-Stop by Brian Aldiss. And this is a science fiction classic. It was published in 1958. And it was one of those kind of seminal books that influenced the trajectory of the genre as a whole. That's why it's a classic, right? This book is set in a world where, well, it's hard to describe this book without giving too much away, but we follow this man called Roy Complain, and he lives in a tribe of humans. The humans live in these ruins that they believe were left behind by beings called the Giants. The tribe is nomadic, so it moves around this environment, these ruins, but the whole time they're kind of accosted by these plants called ponics, and the ponics thrive in adverse conditions. So mainly low light. These humans don't have a lot of access to light, and they have to keep hacking away at these plants, which then grow back very quickly. So it's this kind of constant struggle against their surroundings. Roy Complain is a hunter for this tribe, but something happens when he's out hunting one day, and he, after a series of events, ends up leaving this tribe with a priest and 2 other men to explore the environment and the ruins and the surroundings beyond what their tribe has done. And they venture into these uncharted lands, and what they discover is quite striking, I think. I thought this book was really intelligently crafted. I thought it was inventive. Like, this came out in the 50s, and I still think it holds up today. Bear with me though, there are problems with, for instance, the way female characters in this book are written. There's one in particular who seems like she's going to be an interesting character, and as soon as she falls in love with Roy Complain, she just becomes really bland and uninteresting, and I wasn't pleased with that. Another thing is that, the science in this book is a little bit dated, particularly when it comes to virology. But beyond that, the book had some plot holes, and it introduced something, namely rats that could control other animals that could then in turn control humans, like mind control. Really weird, and it only comes up in one scene, and it's never seen again. And there is no explanation offered by Brian Aldiss. It's bizarre. But I will say, at the end of the book, when you finally find out that key piece of information and everything falls into place, you'll be left feeling pretty satisfied, I think. So overall, not an amazing book, but I still think it was thought-provoking and really ahead of its time. The next book I want to talk about briefly, because it was a reread, is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. This I read immediately before The Testaments, and I think my enjoyment of The Testaments was hampered by the fact that I read this before. But also, I think if I'd read this after The Testaments, it would have been the other way around, because I think The Testaments exposes some of the issues with The Handmaid's Tale, or I guess makes them more apparent, to me anyway. But I reread this. It's been years since I first read this book, and I ended up liking it a bit less. I still enjoy the ending. I still love the way Margaret Atwood crafts this atmosphere, especially in the sense that it's really suggestive. There is this tension between Offred's thoughts, feeling confined and constricted by the system that she's in, and the environment that seems to invite her to interpret it in ways that are sexual and or erotic. For instance, I remember reading there were worms coming out of the ground that resembled lips. I really missed those kinds of little details in the Testaments. So it is a strength of this book that I think the Testaments really could have done with. I did feel that it sagged a bit in the middle, which is not what I remembered. So I would say I enjoyed it a bit less, but I'm happy to own this book and to read it. The next book I want to talk about is I Am Sovereign by Nicola Barker. I Am Sovereign is a really interesting novella, and it's got that kind of typical Nicola Barker chaos going on. So it's about a man who lives in Wales, and he has a hobby where he makes teddy bears, and he's trying to sell his house. He's a very eccentric character. He wears ironic t-shirts, so they have slogans on them that are quite ironic, and each chapter in the novella is named after one of these slogans, which I thought was quite funny. He is an eccentric character and has had some emotional traumas in the past that he is trying to work through. At the same time, we've got his real estate agent called Abigail, not Abigail, Abigail. And then we've got the two prospective home buyers whose names I can't remember, but it's a mother and a daughter. Abigail has had trouble selling this house because of our main character's eccentricities, and on this particular viewing, really strange things start to happen, and that's all I'll say. So the title of the book is actually quite interesting, and it does really become the core theme of the novella by the end, and that's the idea of sovereignty. It first manifests in our main character trying to master his own emotions, because he has these toxic thought cycles, and I think that's the term that's used. He listens to this motivational speaker who uses those kinds of terms and tries to get you to reclaim your sovereignty over your own past and the way that you experience your own emotions. So he's got to focus on that. But in the second half of the book, Nicola Barker decides that she is going to lose control of her own story, and she has a character who is rebelling against being in the novella because he doesn't like how he's being portrayed by Nicola Barker and things like that, and Nicola has to bring in another character instead, and she has to tell the reader this. And she even goes as far to then address the reader about her own work in the third person. She makes mention of Happy, her previous novel, and talks about how Happy represented the end of the novel for her, and she doesn't want to write novels anymore. She just wants to write novellas, and it's like she's taking control and asserting her own sovereignty over her own creative process. It's wild. It's really interesting. And do I think it's going to be an enduring classic? Absolutely not. But as usual, I've come away from Nicola Barker work feeling stimulated, interested, keen to read another one of her books, and overall just a bit giddy or a bit fuzzy because I've read something that was completely unlike anything I've ever read. So I think I gave it 4 stars. The next book I want to talk about is Poems by Elizabeth Bishop. This is Elizabeth Bishop's collected work. It's really difficult to review a poet or any author's collected work because they've gone through so many different artistic phases and ways of looking at the world, often, not always, but often, that to give an overall rating would probably do the book a disservice, especially because there's some unpublished poems in here, some poems that are uncollected, things like that, and also translations. So I'm trying to keep my review centered around the published collections and basically the published poetry, and probably less so the translations which were published but not her original work, and the unpublished poems. Elizabeth Bishop is an American poet who I'm fairly certain is quite popular or quite well renowned, but I'd never heard of her until I found this book and its companion volume called Prose in a Remainder bookstore. And I thought, why not? I need more poetry to read, so I picked it up, and I'm so glad that I did. One thing that strikes me about Elizabeth Bishop's writing is that she doesn't really try to be profound, but she is writing with a sense of purpose, a sense of exactitude. Her control over language is excellent, and she also doesn't really insert herself too much into her own poetry, which I think is interesting. Often she will write about a larger kind of idea. Usually it could be nature, it could be something to do with the sky or a sculpture or something like that. And only in the last stanza or the last couple of stanzas, depending on the length of the poem, does she actually bring it around to an emotional experience that she's had or someone else has had. And that often really enhances the emotional impact of the poem. There's one in particular called Insomnia, and I think it exemplifies this pretty well. The moon in the bureau mirror looks out a million miles, and perhaps with pride at herself, but she never, never smiles. Far and away beyond sleep, or perhaps she's a daytime sleeper. By the universe deserted, she'd tell it to go to hell, and she'd find a body of water or a mirror on which to dwell. So wrap up care in a cobweb and drop it down the well, into that world inverted where left is always right, where the shadows are really the body, where we stay awake all night, where the heavens are shallow as the sea is now deep, and you love me. And I was left reeling. Like, there are multiple instances in this collection where that happens, and it's kind of like a gut punch. I think she writes really effectively. I really do recommend reading this. It's a lot. There's a lot of poetry in here, but it's well worth your while, even if you don't read the unpublished stuff, which I will say is still pretty good. And there are some poems that I really wish she had published. So this, if I were to assign a rating to this, would be 4 stars. I thought it was very good. The last book I want to talk about, and easily the best book of the month, and one of the best books I've read this year, is The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. This is a mystery novel that's set in the New Zealand gold rush. I think the year it started is 1866. And the book is split into sections, chapters really, but there are chapters within these chapters. And the overall structure of the book is mimicking the waning of the moon. And you can see this is evoked on the cover, where each chapter is around half the word count of the preceding chapter, such that when you get to the end of the novel, the chapter's like 1 or 2 pages. Now, I'm not really too well acquainted with the Zodiac. Most, if not all, of the allusions to the Zodiac are completely lost on me. But you don't need to understand the Zodiac or appreciate it to realize that Eleanor Catton is a very gifted writer. So we follow a variety of characters in this book. It's evocative of Victorian novels in that there's a lot of characters. It is set in the Victorian era, but just in a colony. The language used in here is very evocative of that time as well, and I loved that. I thought that Eleanor Catton's writing style was beautiful. Her control of language is admirable, and the characters, they are so well written. One character in particular that I adored was Lydia Wells. I love her dialogue. I love her conversations. I love how cunning she is. I love that she really inhabited the role of the villain really well. But you couldn't help but respect her in a way as well. The book opens with Walter Moody, who has come over from Scotland to seek his fortune in the New Zealand goldfields. And he arrives on a ship, and he's had a very strange experience on the ship that is explained a little bit later in the novel. But he arrives in a town called Hokitika, and he goes to this hotel where there are a group of men who are acting a bit strange, and it soon turns out that they are actually meeting to discuss a series of crimes that have happened in the region recently. For the first part of the book, which is about 360 pages, it's these men telling Walter Moody what has happened, and after that point, the book kind of takes a lot of different perspectives, and the reader is then privy to information that Walter Moody is not, and it kind of allows the reader to then try to work out the mystery themselves. I do think this could be in my top 3 books of the year. I am just amazed by how good this book is. So overall, I loved it. It was an easy 5 stars. Alright, so that is it for the wrap-up. Thank you so much for watching. If you have read any of these books, let me know in the comments below if you liked them, if you didn't like them. And also thank you to all of my new subscribers. I am now at over 200 subscribers. I didn't actually acknowledge when I got 100, which, now that I think about it, is quite weird. But I just wanted to say thank you for everyone who has subscribed, who watches, who comments, who likes, even those who dislike. Thankfully, there are a few of you, but, you know, we have to acknowledge everyone. I hope to be filming some videos for Victober. I am currently reading Middlemarch and loving it, so I hope to have a video out about that. So I'll see you in the next video, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.